I would like to start by reminding you that in his now modern classic on development economics, The Elusive Quest for Growth, which was published in 2001, William Easterly, who worked for several years at the World Bank, famously compared the quest for growth of economies with the ancient themes of the search for a precious object with magical properties. The policy conversation, of course, has moved on quite a bit since 2001, and now the quest is not just for growth per se, but for inclusive growth, and this is why I put this in the title. This shift reflects the now well-documented lesson that there is really nothing automatic in the relationship between economic growth, growth creation, job creation, and poverty reduction. It also reflects, of course, the legitimate aspiration of growth of a certain type of growth with certain characteristics in terms of the economic performance of that growth, but not just measured by the rate of growth, by the employment it generates, by the social benefits, by the equity characteristics, and by the social cohesion. Therefore, this concept of inclusive growth has become central in development efforts and in the development discourse in recent years. In fact, it will most probably enter the global development agenda in the post-2015 period. I'm sure many of you are aware of these negotiations in the UN system by all member states to try to define, and this is going to happen in September this year, a new framework to drive development and the international development community in the next 15 years. If you read the zero draft of the outcome document for this summit on the post-2015 development agenda, which is already out since last week there in the websites, it contains a Goal 8, and this Goal 8 reads, promote sustained, inclusive, and sustainable economic growth, full and productive employment, and decent work for all. So if this stays like this, which is the most likely, this would really be a central tenet of development efforts in the international community for the next 15, 20 years. And yet, if you really think about it, this notion of inclusive growth still lacks clarity as a concept and in terms of what are the policies which are needed to achieve it. I'd therefore like to begin this lecture by offering a definition of inclusive growth, which I think picks up all the relevant elements of the much richer conversation about growth and economic prosperity that the international community is having today. So let us define inclusive growth as growth that achieves all of these seven characteristics, that is sustained over decades, that is broad-based across economic sectors, that creates productive employment that respects labor rights, that reduces poverty, that reduces excessive income inequality, improves access to education and health, and provides basic social protection for all citizens. These are the characteristics that refer directly to inclusiveness. And of course, one would also like growth to be sustainable. And I don't think Anand will allow me to get away with a definition that doesn't include the environmental and sustainability dimension. Now, this is, of course, a long and very ambitious list. It is a vision of economic, social, and environmental progress that is no doubt very inspiring. In fact, one could say that it is a dream as inspiring as Martin Luther King's dream of a promised land, and one that can be easily shared by many people around the world. This definition is properly understood. It combines the objectives of economic prosperity, of social justice, and environmental sustainability. And this is the reason why economists better occupy themselves with how to achieve inclusive and sustainable growth, and devote themselves to this very important quest. Now, the good news is that increasingly economies and international institutions and policymakers at country level are indeed doing just that. But as I said, there's a lack of clarity on the concept and much disagreement about the policies to promote inclusive growth. Having this list already, I think, is quite helpful. After all, until very recently, the conventional wisdom was to say that the state should limit itself to create the enabling environment, and the private sector would do the rest. In contrast, the very idea of inclusive growth, growth with the type of qualities and characteristics that I just mentioned and that you see there in the slide, is built on one assumption, and you could express it in the following way, that it is, there should be some kind of visible hand, if we want to use the classic metaphor, that can accelerate learning and catch up growth and make it more inclusive and socially beneficial in ways that are superior to the outcomes that would emerge if the market were left to its own devices. But the big difference now is that this visible hand is not conceived simply or purely as an enlightened state or government leading the way. The new visible hand is now conceived as a collective learning process that builds on public and private cooperation. That is the result of broad social and multi-stakeholder dialogue, leading to a strong national vision and a widely shared consensus. In other words, it is one that works through institutional arrangements to drive collective action in the desired directions. And this is really quite a paradigm change. And this is quite a departure from the old discussion between then do you need government intervention, do you leave it to the markets, and so on. There's now this institutional view at the center of the discussion. In this lecture, I will not refer to all these 7 ingredients of inclusive growth. Instead, I would like to elaborate on one particular set of policies that are really key to achieve inclusive growth, and these are what used to be called industrial policies, and now, for a number of reasons, better name is productive development policies. Now, before entering into this subject matter, I would like to illustrate the usefulness of the concept of inclusive growth as a benchmark to assess reality in the case of Latin America. This is important to have a sense of the great practical significance of the questions and to give the discussion a sense of reality of what everyday policymakers are confronted. If we apply this concept to Latin America, what do we find? If one looks at the recent record of Latin America, it is clear that the first decade of the 21st century will be remembered as a period of significant growth that resulted in substantive social, economic, and employment progress. You can see these indicators of progress in Latin America from 2002 to 2013. Poverty was reduced from 44 to 28%. Employment rates increased from 52 to 56%. Real average wages grew approximately 1.8% annually. Social security coverage expanded. Health system coverage and pensions expanded from approximately 52 to 60%, depending on how you measure this. Actually, this measure is mostly based on urban areas. It depends if you include rural areas, and some of the measurement problems are complicated. Informal employment was reduced from 52 to 48, and the middle classes grew in several countries. However, with the end of the commodity boom and the lower growth in the world economy, this economic and social progress is not going to be sustainable. In fact, already there are some backward steps in these numbers, at least with the present policies. Latin America is clearly entering and is already quite into a new era, a new cycle of weaker growth. So this means that Latin America doesn't pass the first test of the benchmark definition of inclusive growth that is sustained over decades. Instead, growth continues to be volatile and to be erratic. And this time, not because of the traditional stop-go macroeconomic cycle. This used to be the old discussion that Latin American authorities were a bit irresponsible and let inflation and fiscal deficits go too high, so it was this macro cycle. This time is because there is a huge gap in productivity and there's a continuing dependence of primary commodities. So let us look at the stylized facts on issues of productivity and productive structures in Latin America. The average productivity is half that of the United States. Most of the countries, and this is the most serious, are not really closing the gap. They are diverging from the United States and from the leaders in productivity. In a study in 2010, the Inter-American Development Bank called this the tragedy of Latin America. Most growth in Latin America is explained mostly by factor accumulation and only a small proportion by productivity increases. The productive structures continue to be characterized by what ECLAC, or CEPAL, as some of you might know it, the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, calls a structural heterogeneity, the enormous productivity differences between sectors and between regions within countries. On average, half of employment in the region is still informal employment, and it is estimated that 7 out of every 10 jobs created in the region in the last 15 years are informal, most of them in micro-enterprises and self-employment. The structural transformation of the region has not managed to move sufficient quantities of workers from low productivity occupations to high productivity, higher wage sectors. In fact, some studies suggest that the opposite has happened in some countries. Exports continue to be concentrated on a few commodities in many cases, and the region shows enormous gaps in innovation, education, and workforce skills. There was a recent report, Economic Outlook of the OECD, focused on education and innovation issues. So the region has difficulties in passing the second and the third test of the definition of inclusive growth. Growth that is broad-based across sectors and that creates productive employment, high-quality productive employment, good jobs. Low productivity growth is certainly then the Achilles heel of the growth process in the region, and one of the main reasons why many fear that several countries of the region are falling or are at the risk of falling into the middle income trap. If we look at the fifth criteria for inclusive growth, growth that reduces large income inequality, as you know, Latin America is infamously known to be one of the most unequal regions of the world. It is very important to understand that the productivity and the inequality challenges are not really separate. On the contrary, they are really closely related. Because in Latin America, as in other parts of the world, inequalities are really grounded on that very heterogeneous structure of production and pattern of growth, which combines a few sectors with high productivity with many sectors with low productivity. This means that large inequalities cannot really be addressed, and this is a deep message, this is important, cannot really be addressed only with the levers of social policy. Something more fundamental has to change. Besides the innovative social policies, which are important, like Programa Bolsa Familia in Brazil or Oportunidades in Mexico, and many other social innovations, besides that, the region needs to redouble the efforts in more innovative and effective productive development policies that have more traction in labor markets. Only if you really have policies that have this traction in the labor markets to create more and better jobs, high productivity, high wages, etc., to create more formal jobs, then you can really make a dent not only on the growth issue, but on the inequality issue. Now, this brief analysis of Latin America using the concept of inclusive growth shows how useful this concept is as a lens or benchmark to judge long-term growth and development performance. So I hope this definition helps to clarify the concept and some of the policies needed to advance it. Now, to further clarify the characteristics of inclusive growth and the policies to achieve it, I will now like to, in the rest of the lecture, deep dive, if you like, into the question of productive development policies as one of the major pillars, not the only one, but one of the major pillars for inclusive growth. To introduce the topic, it is good to start with a fact from economic history. And this is that no country has made the arduous journey from widespread rural poverty to post-industrial wealth without proactive government policies and a strong public-private cooperation to affect the economic structure and the dynamism of the economy. You can think of Japan, of Korea, or almost any country. Unfortunately, the conventional wisdom of the last 30 years was overwhelmingly against industrial policies or productive development policies, particularly in Anglo-American scholarship and policy discourse. Proponents of industrial policies were strongly criticized and marginalized. With the so-called Washington Consensus of the 80s and 90s, industrial policy almost died in the economic discourse. But the interesting thing is that it didn't really die in practice. Many countries continued to make intensive use of productive development policies, of course, under various names. Policies to promote competitiveness, develop clusters a la Michael Porter, or with other names. Fortunately, for a series of reasons that there's no time to comment on now, the economic debate has changed. From a very sterile discussion on whether to have this type of policies or not have them, to the more concrete and practical question of how to do it, how to design productive transformation strategies, and how to implement them in concrete situations. And there is a whole range of contributions, recent contributions. Here are some. Joseph Stiglitz and Justin Lin have recently edited 2 volumes entitled The Industrial Policy Revolution. Danny Roderick has written extensively on the subject. That's just one quote, but there's many. Justin Lin has developed an approach that he calls the new structural economics. I'll be commenting in a moment about it. Robert Devlin and Graciela Mogillansky, in their book, Breeding Latin American Tigers, discuss in depth a wealth of institutional arrangements for industrial policies internationally and in Latin America. Mariana Mazzucato published a very influential volume on the Entrepreneurial State, and I will comment on her contribution later on. The Development in the Americas report of the Inter-American Development Bank of 2014, last year, entitled Rethinking Productive Development Policies, is a very solid analysis of policy experiences and institutions to engage in this type of policies successfully. And in 2014, I edited this book. The good news is that you can download it. It's in the ILO website. You can download it all, or the specific chapters, for free. Entitled Transforming Economies, Making Industrial Policy Work for Growth, Jobs and Development. It has contributions from 27 distinguished specialists on the subject, and it has 8 case studies. And in fact, a good deal of what I'm saying today is based on the contributions of this book. So, and there's more, but this is to show that there has been an extraordinary revival of interest and evidence on industrial policies in recent years, and most importantly, this is not just a matter of academic attention. The revival is taking place in practice. Many governments around the world, the private sector and trade unions are really searching for ways to collaborate locally at sectoral level and nationally to accelerate growth and create more and better jobs. And later on, I'm going to talk a bit about the tension that there is between this policy impulse, if you like, towards this type of policies, and the other policy impulse that there's a legacy that has been coming from the 90s, which is towards the negotiation of free trade agreements. Now there is the mega regionals, for instance, and there is a lot of concern to what extent those trade agreements, not so much the WTO, there's more space and the special and differential treatment for some countries, but particularly those agreements really tie the hands to use some of the instruments that countries successfully implemented in terms of productive transformation policy. That's a whole issue in itself. Now, I would like to give you an overview of this vast revival of interest by discussing what we could call 3 mappings, plus one more point. First is a mapping of the different theoretical perspectives in economics to the analysis and design of productive development policies. Secondly, 4 brief narratives of these policies in 4 countries. And third, I will zoom in 2 examples of a very important question, which is the interaction and the importance of coherence between productive development policies and other policies that are often seen as managed, unmanaged as separate silos, which is very unfortunate because it is important to have an integrated approach and synergies between different policy areas. And I'm going to end up with the consideration of what I think is the frontier territory, which are the institutional challenges. What are the institutions for successful productive development policies, which, as I said, this is, in a way, the new invisible hand, institutions based on public-private cooperation, public-private partnerships, multi-stakeholder consultations, et cetera, and the all the issue of implementation of this. So let me start with the main theoretical perspectives. which are really four: neoclassical economics, structuralism, evolutionary theory, and institutional economics. Neoclassical economics is the standard paradigm of economics. By the way, how many economists here in the room? Okay, well, that's like a third or more. Fine. So, well, you will forgive me for this simplification now, but it is well known that neoclassical economics uses a perfectly competitive market based on the assumption of rational choice by economic agents as an idealized norm or benchmark against which to assess reality, and it justifies policy interventions as a way to remedy market failures based on this norm. Technology, by the way, is treated normally, at least in this particular paradigm, as external or exogenous variable. Of course, there's a big story around growth models, but I'm not going to refer to that. Now growth models are making technology more endogenous and all the rest of it. Now, the point is that to do economics without this neoclassical logic and the related economics of welfare is like trying to travel to other planets without knowledge of physics. However, unfortunately, the way many economists in this tradition have approached the subject has led to this sterile discussion in which either vertical or sectoral interventions are rejected as questionable attempts at picking winners. Always you discuss this and say, oh, you are favoring picking winners, and that's really bad. Or the discussion is caught in this debate in which I consider is a false dilemma between, you have to choose between market failures and government failures. And since so many governments are so myopic and consistently have shown that they are so bad, I prefer to remain with the market failure. So forget government intervention, because that's just always worse. Now, as I said, the good news is that recently the so-called institutional economics has evolved as an extension of this tradition, and applying the tools of neoclassical economics has provided a lot of insights to break this false dilemma and talk much more seriously and more analytically about the institutions for public-private cooperation, public-to-public coordination, and the structure, the behavior, the incentives, the performance of different institutional models. And this is really the difficult question. And Vice Chancellor, this is the conversation we had just a few minutes before coming here. A modern application of neoclassical economics to select and prioritize sectors for government support was proposed by Justin Lin, who was chief economist of the World Bank from 2008 to 2012. I'm going to describe briefly his approach because I think it's interesting. His objective is to address the limited operational policy recommendations of neoclassical approaches while staying grounded in the logic of welfare economics. He proposed 6 steps to select and prioritize sectors for government support. He recommends promoting activities that have had the following characteristics. And remember, this is from the World Bank. He was chief economist of the World Bank. Yes, he was proposing something that was traditionally seen as quite interventionist, quite dirigist, if you like, from the point of view of state policy. He proposed to promote activities that have been growing dynamically during 20 years in rapidly growing economies with similar factors, endowments, and that have approximately twice the GDP. This is what he calls the comparable countries. In other words, if you're a policymaker in a country, look at these other countries, not too far. I mean, you don't want to compare yourself with the United States or with Finland, the number ones in the ranking of the World Competitiveness Report, but countries with these characteristics, and then give priority to those activities in which national enterprises have already entered spontaneously. In other words, if you don't produce cars, don't think that suddenly you're going to have a manufacturing plant for cars, but try to see what you have and build step by step from those companies you already have. The intention of this methodology is to be able to engage in industrial policy, but avoiding interventions, as Lin himself insists a lot, that defy comparative advantage. He said, don't defy comparative advantage, or just defy it a little bit, not too much, and promoting those that conform to comparative advantage. Lin's approach has been subject to wide debate, and I would like to rescue three points from this debate. First, the intention of overcoming the limitations of the neoclassical approach, in particular what I have called this sterile debate between choosing between market failures, government failures, is a very positive step. As I said, this debate has been unnecessarily polarized, and I think has done a lot of damage to a constructive conversation about this field of policies. Secondly, as Hayun Chang, who I understand was here last year, giving the lecture, Lin is right in saying that the more an industrial policy deviates from comparative advantage, the more risky the policy becomes. But at the same time, the approach fails to recognize that many countries have taken such policy risks with great success. So the debate goes on. And third, a problem with this approach is that in focusing only on static comparative advantages, it doesn't really give sufficient attention to the dynamics of technological modernization, increasing returns activities, and the impressive processes of accelerated learning that you see in the most successful cases. Now, the second approach to this is structuralism. It's a perspective that is very closely linked to the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean. According to a review by Jose Antonio Ocampo, which is actually here in the book, the structuralist perspective is based on three premises: that growth, job creation, and development happen through increases in productivity of enterprises and sectors based on technological and organizational changes. Well, of course, that's not, a very special insight, except that in neoclassical economics, the whole technological aspect and the whole structural transformation was put aside a bit. Secondly, that growth happens through changes in the composition of economic activities. This is why it's called structuralism. That is, through the structural transformation of the economy. And that what brings about the growth of income is not so much what the neoclassical approach focuses on, which is specialization, the advantages of specialization, an idea that goes back to Adam Smith, but processes of productive diversification. So is it diversification, and how do you promote that? And third, that countries need productive development strategies which require a proactive, not a passive role for government. In addition, the structuralists insist on the need to maintain competitive exchange rates as an essential ingredient of productive development strategies. There's a lot of literature, a big debate about the role of the exchange rate, and of course, it's now been demonstrated that if you have overvalued exchange rate, this can be very negative for your export prospects. And this is a problem that has been discussed as the Dutch disease, countries that have oil and then the exchange rate appreciates, countries that have a lot of short-term capital inflows and so on. So that's a big debate there. Now, the third approach is evolutionary economics. This focuses on how processes of learning, technological change, and innovation happen and drive productive transformation and productivity growth. Evolutionary economics argues that high-performing economies are those that have found ways to move productive and employment structures from low-quality activities, you see the characteristics there, to high-quality activities with that definition. This approach conceives growth as a cumulative process and emphasizes that what an economy produces and exports today matters for the production and export potential of tomorrow. In other words, growth trajectories of tomorrow depend on the efforts and degree of diversification and the capabilities of today. There's a very interesting recent variation of this approach that has been developed by Ricardo Hausmann, Cesar Hidalgo, and others at Harvard. They focus on the sources and the dynamics of accumulation of productive knowledge in a society as reflected in the complexity of the products that a society makes, and view the economic development of countries as a process of discovering which products a country can master. And this, they call it, this, by now I think, a classic article of Ricardo Hausmann with others, self-discovery. The basic insight is that the amount of productive knowledge a society uses is reflected in the variety of firms it has, in the variety of occupations, and think this is people behind the occupations that these firms require, and in the extent of interactions between, the nature of the interactions between firms. Economic complexity is a measure of how intricate this network of interactions is and how much productive knowledge a society has. And the most important contribution of this Harvard group is that they have measured these things. They published something called the Atlas of Economic Complexity. That has been published, I think it's the third volume now, started publishing in 2011. And they estimate various indexes of economic complexity. They have graphical representations of what they call the product space that tries to represent the capabilities and the potential in a society for economic diversification and growth. So this is the ideas of innovation and evolutionary economics, but with a measurement dimension, so it's extremely interesting. Now, at the intersection of these different perspectives, these different three perspectives on productive transformation, technology, and innovation, lies a very abundant literature on institutions for productive development. This literature emphasizes the role of institutional arrangements for coordination between the different agents involved in the policies, and for efficient policy implementation, as well as for disciplining rent-seeking and abuses, which was something which was also very problematic in the literature. I would say actually that the rigorous analysis of the different institutional arrangements for public, private, and multi-stakeholder collaboration is nowadays the new frontier of the academic and also the practitioners' discussion around productive development and innovation policies. This is not a field with which economists felt comfortable in the past. Probably many don't feel comfortable now, but there are many good economists working on this. The key policy questions with which many governments, policymakers, and academics are struggling include this list. And you can see how relevant, how practical, how important these questions are. What role does experimentation play in productive development policies? What is the best way to organize public-private collaboration to discover problems and come up with solutions? How do countries accumulate capabilities for productive development? How do they accumulate technical, operational, and political, the so-called top capabilities to successfully carry out productive development policies? And when you apply these things, there's literature that says, well, look, yes, of course, developed countries can do industrial policies because they have very good top technical, operational, political capabilities, but you cannot do industrial policies in many countries in Africa because, where are the technical, operational, and political capabilities, etc. So these are very real important debates. How can the public sector organize to break silos and have the necessary interagency collaboration? How to identify sectors worth supporting and decide on the competitive bets, if you like, with the maximum probability of success? What mechanisms can be used to promote more collaboration and protect from capture from the private sector? So this is really, all of these are the issues that I think are at the frontier of a lot of research now. Now, I'd like to now discuss three key issues around the debate. The concept of capabilities, the question of industrial policies in what we could call the era of global value chains, and a fresh perspective on the role of the state in innovation, which is Mariana Mazzucato's contribution. As you have already no doubt noticed, this idea of capability is a common thread running through much of these debates. But the concept, again, has lacked clarity. Questions like where do capabilities reside, how do they evolve, how can policies support them, have not really been satisfactorily answered. A colleague of mine at the ILO, Ingvar Nubler, and co-editor of this book, in fact, in chapter 4 of this book, addresses this. She makes a distinction between productive capacities that reside in the factor endowment, the traditional concept of factor endowment by countries, as conventionally defined land, labor, capital, and productive capabilities, as opposed to capacities, that exist instead in the sphere of non-material knowledge of society, in the knowledge that resides in individuals, but also at the collective levels, where? In enterprises, in organizations, public and private organizations, and in value chains, etc. In this view, the productive know-how is, of course, related to the formal education system, but even more important is the learning that happens in enterprises, in value chains, in public and private organizations, and the way in which these interact. This is what defines the productive capabilities of a society. And this is very close, of course, to Hausmann and the Harvard Group. This is what they're trying to measure, this learning and these capabilities. Within this perspective, productive development policies are about promoting learning strategies at all levels. And see, here there's a completely different approach here. It's not a matter of, are you distorting or not distorting? It's, are you promoting learning or not? And what are the institutions for promoting learning? But learning is not just what happens in lecture rooms and formal education, or even in vocational training. It is really the knowledge in the enterprises, in the sectors, the know-how of society. A recent, more theoretical and mathematically oriented volume along similar lines was written and published last year by Joseph Stiglitz and Bruce Greenwald, and the title is Creating a Learning Society, so it's developing this type of ideas. And there are also important contributions to this question of capabilities by Charles Havel, Land Pritchett, Matt Andrews, and Jorge Kornick. Okay, this is the other topic I wanted to touch, which is the global value chain reality. There's a lot of attention. A big proportion of world trade now happens through global value chains. And there's an important literature that has developed around the question how to make industrial policy, what to do. How do you, if you are a policymaker, you're a minister of industry and trade in a developing country, what can you do, if anything, to link up your companies and people and small, medium-sized enterprises and so on to the global value chains? This is not really a distinct conceptual approach, but there is a new reality there, and then this is a very important question. I very briefly would just like to draw your attention to 3 points that emerge from this literature. First is that to facilitate the successful integration of local companies as suppliers to global value chains, local policy interventions need to be quite granular, quite chain-specific. In other words, forget just general across-the-board, measures. You really have to engage with the companies. You have to understand the value chains. This means that more rather than less selectivity and targeting is required. Secondly, these global value chains generally have a few leading companies at the top of the pyramid and many suppliers at the bottom. That means that they have very asymmetric market structures and also very asymmetric governance structure along the value chains. And this means that policies and measures by governments and local suppliers require a very good understanding of the corporate strategies of the leading multinational companies that are leading the value chain. Whether it is that you are contacting these companies to attract them to invest in the country, or whether it is that you're persuading them to develop suppliers, local suppliers in your country. And third, it is not enough to focus on the economic upgrading dimension. A lot of the literature is focused on the economic upgrading. Policies should also integrate the upgrading of the social and environmental dimensions. The social dimension includes employment, wages, working conditions in the value chains, compliance with international labor standards, etc. These are very real problems. You remember the problem in Bangladesh with the Rana Plaza, well, that's an extreme example, but less extremes in everywhere. There's a lot of issues and problems about to what extent the leading company in the value chain is responsible for the labor standards, respect for labor rights along the value chain. We can talk that afterwards. It's a very important question. We in the ILO, of course, work a lot on that. But the point here is that a key part of modern industrial policy are the institutions and the measures to ensure compliance with norms and standards, and this includes the areas of product, process, labor, and environmental standards. Finally, I would like to mention briefly a very important contribution by Mariana Mazzucato in her influential book of 2012, The Entrepreneurial State, Debunking Public versus Private Sector Myths. Mazzucato, who is a professor at Sussex University, specializes in science and technology, focuses on innovation mostly in developed countries, frankly, not so much in developing countries, and argues on the basis of some very, very well-documented cases in the pharmaceutical industry, the computer, information technology, and other sectors, that while entrepreneurship is, of course, very important, the entity that takes the boldest risks and achieves the highest breakthroughs is not the private sector, but it has been the much maligned state. She's very provocative. At the first time you listen to this idea, you say, well, this is ridiculous. What about Silicon Valley and the startups and the whole thing? Well, this is what she's arguing. Say, look, there's a lot of hype about that. I mean, it's not to say this is not important, of course, but let's look at it in more detail, and she does. She shows, for instance, that all the technologies which make the iPhone smart were funded by the state. The internet, the wireless networks, the global positioning system, the GPS, the microelectronics, the touchscreen displays, and the voice-activated, the Siri system, personal assistant. The genius of Apple, she argues, or if you like, of Steve Jobs, was to put all this together, and it requires genius to do it. But Apple was gathering low-hanging fruit of 7 decades of state-supported innovations. Mazzucato also shows how promoting innovation involves more than state support for research and development. She provides examples of the state acting as an active entrepreneur, taking risks, and of course, in some cases, inevitably failing. She reminds how the United States government has been a developmental state since the days of Alexander Hamilton. I think Mazzucato is in a crusade. It's not an exaggeration if you read her book or see her videos in YouTube and so on. She's a fantastic debater. You should invite her here, by the way, if I may suggest. But she's in a crusade to change the conversation about the role of the state and the private sector in promoting innovation and new technologies, and she seems to be succeeding. Her point is not to belittle entrepreneurship, but to properly recognize the role of government in driving innovation, and to better understand the detailed interaction between public policy and private sector contributions. And again, I think this is extremely important. Let me move to, briefly, a few narratives, because I think, again, in the spirit of giving you the sense of how important these issues are. So I'm going to talk about Korea and China and the United States briefly. In the nearly 40 years since the early 60s until 97, the Asian crisis of 97, the Republic of Korea maintained rates of growth of 7% or more. That's huge. That's amazing. I mean, this is why there's a lot of literature about the Korean miracle. Income per capita increased from 17% of the OECD average in 1970 to 90% of the OECD average in 2010. The engine of this growth was productivity growth that was double that of the OECD. Expenditures in research and development as percentage of GDP increased from 1.8 in 1990 to 2.9, almost 3% in 2005. This was higher at that time that of any other OECD countries, including that of the United States. One of the most interesting aspects in the case of Korea was the close coordination of education and vocational training policies with industrial policies. The economic miracle was accompanied by an educational miracle, you can say. Korea built schools, polytechnics, universities, and a vast network of public and private vocational training centers. And all the education system was organized with a strong orientation towards the demand of productive sectors. Around the year 2000, Korea produced the highest proportion of graduates in science and engineering than any other country in the world. And look, I just make a parenthesis here, because I'm come from Latin America. And this is a region in which, if you go to most universities are not technological universities, like you described this one by Chancellor. Most universities see themselves as humanities universities, and there are huge resistance to talk with the private sector, huge resistance. Say, well, I'm not to talk, I'm not going to get commercialized. There are very few exceptions of universities that have incubators or that allow lecturers, professors, researchers, laboratories to engage with the private sector in any way, shape, or form. So this is the importance of this debate, this discussion. I mean, there are countries where the private sector and the education sector are in parallel universes, compared with a case like Korea, where there was this tremendously close collaboration. Since 2001, a key policy for productive development was the Human Resource Development Strategy. The Ministries of Education and Human Resources were merged. The minister was promoted to sole prime minister. There was a ministerial commission for human resource development that was established with the participation of 14 ministries, etc., etc. I think in terms of time, I will stop there. There's a lot more to say, of course, huge story on Korea. But let me say a few words on Brazil. In 2004, the government of President Lula brought back industrial policy after a long period of neglect. This was done in a first phase until 2007 with a program entitled Industrial Technology and Foreign Trade Policy. Then you can see there the second and the third phases, and there are some characteristics. There's a chapter here in Korea, there's a chapter here in Brazil if you are interested in the details. But the aspect that I would like to mention is, and that really has called a lot of attention internationally from South Africa, from other countries, is the case of the role of the National Development Bank of Brazil, the BNDES, in leading and financing industrial policy. Because of its size and range of instruments, the BNDES played a very important and very proactive role with direct financing for large-scale industrial and infrastructure projects, financing for machinery and equipment through commercial banks. This is second-level kind of financing, support to exports of engineering-intensive goods and services, credit and credit guarantees for SMEs, small, medium-sized enterprises, the stock funds, venture capital, and direct investment in enterprises. Again, this is a very brief, just comment, but the jury is really still out there on the impact of all this activity. But the fact is that the Brazilian Development Bank is a model in itself as a leading institution in the industrial policy process, and there's no doubt that the following months and years we will have more assessments of to what extent this was successful or not, what lessons. In Brazil, just 2 months ago, there was a book on the productivity challenge of Brazil. So despite all of this, I'm not saying that Brazil is a great case. I mean, it's a great country. They do a lot of things very well. They produce, the Embraer airplanes and all sorts of sophisticated things. But there's also, on average, a massive productivity gap with the United States, and it doesn't seem to be closing. Now, China. You all know that, of course, China has used a whole range of industrial policies and more, very much with Chinese characteristics, which means that they are not easy to emulate, and some of them only work if you are as big as China, and companies cannot afford not to be in your market. But if you are a small economy, many of the things that China did cannot be done. Still, an interesting aspect is how China linked fiscal and social policies with its productive transformation objectives. During the first period of reform in the 90s, the emphasis was on public investment in infrastructure and capital-intensive industrial development, and also on labor-intensive exports. But since the late 90s, policies changed towards building what they call a harmonious society. But this was much more than a slogan. You know that Chinese have, interesting metaphors to refer to policies and principles, but this is much more than a slogan. Because it reflected a policy change to give more attention to social and labor market issues, to address the growing inequality, the extreme inequality that the model was generating, an extreme social polarization. This new policy orientation made efforts to better align labor compensation with productivity growth. Rather than pursuing growth based on cheap labor, it also established minimum wages, adopted labor legislation compatible with ILO conventions to improve respect for labor rights. In fact, the Chinese came very close to the ILO and continue to be working very, 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 very close. And the ILO advised on a whole range of labor rights issues and so on when they passed 2 laws some 5 or 6 years ago. All of this was also part of the rebalancing of the Chinese growth model towards the domestic market and reduction of the excessive reliance on exports. The 12th five-year development plan also placed renewed emphasis on innovation as a driver of growth. And the fourth case I would like to very briefly mention is the United States. As I already suggested, it is ironic that, particularly among Anglo-American economists, there is a widespread view that the United States does not engage in industrial policies, and that the backbone of U.S. competitiveness is only the private sector and the startup and entrepreneurship issue and so on. At least in the public debate, there has been a lot of hype about the entrepreneurial capitalism model of the U.S., and there has been neglect or denial of the role of public policies. Now, it is true that in the United States, at the level of the federal government, there is no major coordinating agency. There is no industrial policy agency, federal industrial policy agency. However, as Robert Wade and Mazzucato as well and others have demonstrated, there are very proactive and indeed effective industrial policies in many other levels. State governments in cities and regions and around key federal government agencies that have been very well financed, financing networks for research, linking public and private laboratories, enterprises, universities, venture capital, etc. The main federal agencies with these characteristics are the Department of Defense. Well, this is very famous, but it's not the only. John Kenneth Galbraith, 40 years ago, 30 years ago, was talking about the military-industrial complex, etc. The Department of Energy, the National Institutes of Health, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, the Small Business Administration, the National Science Foundation. All of these agencies have innovation funds, organize competitions, allocate resources, and promote partnerships around specific sectors and technologies. Many basic technologies have been developed with public funds. All examples include computers, nuclear energy, the transistor, laser technology, satellites. More recent examples include the basic technologies behind the iPhone that I just mentioned, semiconductors, biotechnologies. At present, the DARPA program, DARPA is Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, is promoting innovations in robotics and electric cars. So what Robert Wade concludes in a chapter here in this book is that the US has had what he calls a developmental state in disguise, and that the idea that the United States has not had or does not have industrial policy is a myth. Okay, so what are the lessons from these cases? I mean, there are more cases, of course. There's a lot of literature now, many different countries drawing conclusions on these aspects. But in brief, I would say from Korea, the lesson is that it is not possible to have an economic revolution, or if you want to use the word miracle, even though it's not a miracle, without a revolution in education and vocational training. From Brazil, that it is important to use vigorously the mechanisms of development banking. From China, that macro, fiscal, industrial, and social inclusion policies should not be kept separate, but must interact to promote more inclusive growth. And from the United States, I think the lesson is, do as they do, not as the mainstream economists say. In other words, there's a lot to learn from the arrangements and institutions the United States has to promote innovation, collaboration, networks, regional competitiveness, and the leading role of public and private institutions. Look, I just want to ask how we are with time, because I think this is, I should be trying to wrap up now. So I am going to skip over this. This is basically a section that I was planning to tell you, about interactions with macroeconomic policies and with trade, which is very interesting and very important. But I think I'm just going to go to the issue of what I call the new frontier and wrap up with that. As I said, institutions for productive development policies is where really the massive problems are. How do you organize to be effective, to avoid capture, etc.? Like all policy making, productive development policies or industrial policies, they have a technocratic dimension and a political economy, one. Technocratic dimension is that you need knowledge in the public officials. This means you need to have a dedicated and qualified bureaucracy with good knowledge of the portfolio of policy instruments, capacities for evaluation and performance, and negotiation with all the stakeholders. If they don't have it, countries need to build such a bureaucracy. But look, this is also, and this has also been debated, the same is true of health policy. I mean, to have a good health system, this applies. To have good education system, this applies. So there's, in that sense, nothing special, nothing impossible. Industrial policy is not necessarily the brain surgery specialization of public policy. This is what Danny Roderick called the normalization of industrial policy. The political economy dimension is because, like any other policy agencies and bureaucrats are embedded in economic, political, and social arrangements. Successful economies are those that have the institutions to develop and implement policy and adapt it to the changing circumstances. We know that the market by itself will underdeliver. Only good institutional arrangements, what I have earlier called the new visible hand, can accelerate learning and growth. Much has been learned about how to design incentives and institutions to avoid abuse and capture. And again, this goes to this old debate about the government fails so much, there's so many mistakes that don't do it. Now how to set standards, automatic sunset clauses, so certain things happen automatically, certain subsidies or certain supports finish, built-in program reviews, monitoring mechanisms, establishment of clear benchmarks for success or failure, and periodic evaluation exercises, etc. Of course, all this requires competent agencies and requires checks and balances, a certain role for Congress, even if you like, for transparency of what is going on. But it is all doable, and there's been a lot of learning about how to do it. Another lesson is that productive development policies need to mobilize not just business leaders and public policy makers, but also academics, trade unionists, civil society groups, and not only at the national, but also regional and municipal level. A lot of things are crucially locally and a provincial level. It doesn't have to be all national policy. All these actors have a legitimate role to play. The effective and consistent exercise of this role requires effective coordination mechanisms. And again, there's a vast experience with national competitiveness councils. Latin America has, Chile has, Colombia has had sectoral councils or committees. Very good experience of sectoral councils or committees for skills mismatch issues and seeing how to really address the skills requirements of the sectors and the companies in the sectors. Informal networks of communities of practice and public-private partnerships. Okay, so now I would like to recapitulate. In this overview of the productive development policies, and remember, I started with that definition of inclusive growth, and productive development policies are one pillar, but a massive one for inclusive growth, and there are other things that need to be done. I have given you then a definition of inclusive growth. I have mapped out the main theoretical perspectives in economics that are useful for the design of this type of policies. I have, in the third place, shared with you 4 country narratives to illustrate the range and impact of such policies and the importance that they have. And, well, I have not discussed some policy interactions that I was going to discuss, but that is good. I think that's an invitation for you to go to the book and to literature and look at the synergies with other policy areas. But unfortunately, the point is that normally, because of the bureaucratic divisions of governments and so on, they are treated as silos. And the one reason why there's all these competitiveness committees, presidential committees, and so on, is try to bring the different ministries together, try to make one coherent, integrated approach to policy. Let me wrap up by emphasizing a very important point, and this is my last point, on the relationship between growth and jobs that has been throughout the lecture. The conventional wisdom to explain the slow growth, see if I have something on this, yeah. The conventional wisdom is to argue that the main constraint on employment growth are the distortions or imperfections in labor markets. So you have the labor economies and a huge debate, and some international institutions say you want more jobs, then you have to have more flexibility in labor markets. And this is a huge fight. I tell you, I'm coming from the ILO, between employers and workers in the ILO. You know, what kind of labor law you need, what kind of labor reform, to what extent you really get more employment if you make the labor market more flexible, or if you have too rigid labor market, etc. The conventional wisdom, therefore, often equates employment policy with labor market policies. So if at the end of this lecture there's one point to take away, or that I would like you to take away, let me suggest to you that this point is the following. Labor markets and labor market institutions are very important for reducing inequalities and for building just societies. They are really at the core of many models, and particularly in European societies. In many developing countries, the labor market is still very underdeveloped in terms of the infrastructure of the labor market. However, and particularly in developing countries, employment policy cannot be reduced to labor market policy as conventionally understood. What I have tried to argue in this lecture, the bottom line point is that employment policy in developing countries is productive development policy, more than purely labor market policy. Because productive development policies are the main instrument to create more and better jobs. They act through improved labor market outcomes. They are also the main instrument for advancing several much cherished development objectives: poverty reduction, the reduction of informality, the improvement of equity and social justice. In short, for promoting inclusive growth as defined at the beginning of this lecture. And this is so because poverty, inequality, informality, low productivity, and low growth are phenomena, as I said at the beginning, grounded on the productive structures of countries. So only by changing such structures of production can really these fundamental development objectives be achieved. So this is what I wanted to share with you. Sorry if it was a bit too long, and I think there's a bit of time for questions and answers that I'll be happy to do.
Thanks very much. There's been time for some questions. Does anyone have to know what we do? Yes, please.
Could I ask a question? The productive development policies...
Can you say who you are before you ask a question?
John Baruch, I'm in the computing department. The productive development policies that we see in the UK and in Germany and across Europe seem to be associated with the word austerity. We're having a very big demonstration, I think, on Saturday. The Greeks are particularly facing this problem at the moment. And it's likely, however they sort it out there, will have all sorts of implications for the rest of Europe. What do you think we should do about productive development policies in Europe?
Should I go ahead and answer that? No, yeah.
Please.
Well, look, the austerity policies are not really productive development policies. I mean, this is an exercise in financial programming, if you like. It's the size of public expenditure, the arguments whether, what is the tax burden that you have and whether you can, as a country, afford the whole range of expenditures, including on, public sector employees and so on. So this is really, the macro framework. But this is why there's an interaction with productive development policies. But the productive development policies in Europe, and there is an issue there because Europe has been growing, even if we forget about the crisis, the financial crisis, Europe was growing very low before the crisis. And of course, after the crisis, it continues to grow very low, and in addition, it has indicators of labor market which are very bad. Unemployment, youth unemployment in Spain is 50%, et cetera, et cetera. Well, Europe really, particularly at the level of the Commission and in individual countries, has a whole, I think, the whole range of productive development policies you can imagine. Innovation funds, support for universities, all sorts of initiatives at the level of the Commission with important funds. In fact, many of the countries, I think, that joined the European Union benefited tremendously. Spain, Greece itself, with the cohesion funds, the structural funds. Those were really the productive development policies. I mean, I'm sure you've been to Spain, you've been to many countries. The highways, the infrastructure that was developed, huge transfers of resources, which helped to develop productively, quite a lot. But of course, it's a very sophisticated, I think, productive structure. I think beyond the problems of austerity and so on, which is relatively short term, I don't want to belittle them, they are important and they are causing great damage in some countries. The predicament of Europe is, in fact, partly the result of the competition, of Asian countries and other, emerging economies. Because you have a whole new reality in the world. You have this new, what is called the new geographies of growth, in China and so on. And there are also new geographies of skills, which means many companies, go and invest there, not just to sell to that market, but a lot of investments are also to tap on these new pools of PhDs and highly educated, relatively cheap labor, because these are PhDs, you can do research and development in China or in Thailand or in Malaysia or in some Latin American countries, of the same quality, often with students, Latin American or Asians, that went to even the same universities in Europe and the United States, but in that context, they are cheap. So all the issue of outsourcing and jobs that are not created in Europe and the United States, but are being created in other places. So I think in the long term, it is a combination of that kind of rise of the South, rise of the emerging economies, the new geography of growth and skills, plus, we were talking with the Chancellor before, the new technologies. There's no doubt that in some areas, robotics and so on, new technologies are displacing jobs. So I think in a way, there are two phenomena at the same time. You had long-term trends that were accelerating. Some authors talk now about the several technological revolutions, and this time very different because they're all exponential, and they have accelerated in, say, this century. And at the same time, the crisis hit. So the crisis kind of accelerated the impact, and now in the recovery, this is why the recovery is so weak, because it goes on top all the damage done by the crisis. Think of the 50% youth unemployment in Spain. But then you have the deeper long-term structural changes that you can now produce the same or much more with less people. So you have this deeper aspect. So I'm afraid I don't have... well, but to end on a positive note, if it's possible, not talk about Spain, but talk about Germany. You know, we in the ILO have strongly worked with Germany, with Switzerland, with Austria, with countries that have the dual apprenticeship system, for instance, and say, look, normally in all the debates between development economies, we say there are no magic bullets. But I always say for youth unemployment, if there is something close to a magic bullet, is dual apprenticeship. And you know, it's the system in which you are studying something, it's 3 or 4 years, you do half of it in the vocational training institution, the theory, but you are in the company, so you really learn. And it's very clear when you get your certificate what you can do. Companies get to know you. The figure, depending on the country, is 90%, 85% of the graduates get a job immediately. Is the fastest way to really, you know, get a transition to the job market. So I think it's no coincidence that the countries with the crisis that had the less increase in youth unemployment were the countries that have more, this is part of our research, have more developed dual apprenticeship systems. So I think there's a lot to learn about that. In Latin America now, there's a lot of interest in trying to bring the legislation and the framework for doing more of this dual apprenticeship system.
Okay, thanks. Yes, please. Could people hear the questions? Do you want to wait? There is a roving mic, and maybe you should wait. There's another one here. Why don't we use the microphone? That would be good. Can you say who you are, please?
Yes, my name is Manuel. I'm a master's student at the SID. My question is on the structural transformation of economies. I think the advice has usually been for developing countries to move from extractive or agricultural industries and then going to manufacturers and then services. And you just, in responding to the last question, you were mentioning about this issue of emerging economies and the new geographies. What sort of advice then would you give to developing countries now, given the rise, say, of Chinese manufacturing, which in some cases is actually hampering growth of manufacturing sectors in say, African developing countries, and also now where you're sort of seeing a trend moving from agriculture, jumping manufacturing and going to services. And I think the economic theory says services are not good for sustained growth and for increasing employment, which is also important. So what sort of advice then would you say for these developing countries in sub-Saharan Africa in terms of productive development policies relating to their structural transformation?
Yeah, good question. Good question.
Where are you from? Sorry.
He's from BCID, but originally from BCID.
From Malawi.
From Malawi.
Okay, yeah. No, just to know, to refer to Africa. Well, look, let's see, it's very interesting. Maybe I should, because of the microphone. Traditionally, if you look at this, very well established Kuznets and, the very good tradition of economists looking at the structures of information and how the structure of information, as you said, was equivalent to, you start as a basically rural agricultural economy, then you industrialize, so you can see, the graph goes to population in industry as the country becomes industrialized, and this is why there was so much of import substitution industrialization in Latin America, and so on, say, well, industrialize, because that in a way imitates the development pattern of, say, Europe and the United States in their time, 100 years, 80 years before or more, and then you get into services. If you look at the recent estimates of this, the complicated news is, and again you mentioned that, on the one hand that you have this factory of the world in China that has been flooding the rest of the world with labor-intensive exports. So that's something that has affected even Mexico, for instance. Even after having a free trade agreement with the United States, Mexico has been affected, and all Latin America, and of course Africa is affected by that. At the same time, because the countries have opened up more to trade, so the exports from China and other Asian countries, hit more. So import competition it's stronger. And the third impact is, again, technology. That, industrializing now doesn't require the same amount of labor for the same amount of production than in the past. So the estimates, and this is like, economists like Arvind Subramanian has been studying this in the case of India, and he calls it a premature deindustrialization. Because it's not only that you're not industrializing enough, is that whatever industry you had, now you're deindustrializing because, robotics and this and that. So, well, it looks pretty worrying picture, but it doesn't necessarily have to be like that. Let's see. In the case of the first factor, China, what's happening in China is that wages are increasing quite fast, particularly in the coastal areas. Of course, China has millions and millions of people not in the coastal areas. So some people say, well, look, what Karl Marx used to call the reserve army of labor. I mean, the surplus labor that in China is still very big. But there is a general trend for China to become more expensive, actually promoted by the Chinese, development plans, because they need to develop the internal market. China cannot continue betting their growth on the rates of growth of exports of the rest of the world. The rest of the world is just not going to buy so much of China. I mean, and this has been actually discussed in the G20, and it's called the whole debate about the rebalancing of the world economy. When rebalancing, the main country that has to rebalance is China, in a way. And they have understood that, and they're promoting the domestic market. Imagine if you have a domestic market of 1.4 billion people, well, this is really, enormous. So you can get a lot of mileage in terms of growth from ensuring that you have a middle class that consumes, that buys, and this is what's happening. This is what's happening. So this means that China is going to price itself out. Well, this is the argument. That it's going to price itself out of many niches of labor-intensive manufacturing. And that's an opportunity for Africa. Look, I was in a panel with Justin Ling some months ago, and he emphasizes this argument a lot. And of course, the discussion is, how long, is this going to take? But I would say that in terms, if I was in Africa or advising, as you were, your question, policymakers in Africa, definitely is to think that you have to create your own domestic investment climate and conditions in terms of infrastructure, and begin betting at attracting companies or developing your own companies that can begin substituting many of the things that China is just not going to be able to continue to produce, so cheaply. Secondly, I don't want to do this too long, is that there's now a whole, again, discussion, very interesting one, that can you really develop based on services or not? Do you really need to industrialize? Or you can successfully, increase living standards and achieve all the desirable inclusive growth and so on based on services? Well, it depends who you are and where and what kind of services you're talking about. You know, I mean, some small islands in the Caribbean have done, you know, with tax holidays and so on, you know, have made tremendous changes. But okay, you need to be a small island with 500,000 people or even 300,000 for services to make a big difference. But not only that, a lot of high quality services. If you have strong industry with very, very high productivity, and if you think that around 80%, depending on the product, 70% or even more of the $1 value or €1 value of an industrial final industrial product is services, then you realize that services, yes, there can be a lot of high quality services that provide high income. I mean, not just financial services, but packaging and consultancies and I mean all sorts of services. There's another interesting literature. All this is a bit of speculation. Some authors have tried to measure it. Is that if you have a large middle class with a big purchasing power, a lot of the personal services, you know, people spend. I mean, think of the spas, think of the massage parlors, think of the. I mean, there is a lot of the tourism. It's a huge growth of tourism in the world. All these are the middle classes that are, you know, spending at hard this capacity. So there is traction. There are linkages of services with industry and with the growing middle classes. So look, there is no, you know, ABC answer on this, but these are, you know, some of the things that need to be taken into account. But in terms of Africa, I think there's a lot to do. And just perhaps one final comment. The distinction between agriculture, industry, services, all this is kind of disappearing now. I mean, we still have statistical systems that distinguish with definitions that would apply 40, 50 years ago. The reality now is that, you know, a product is a mixture of everything. And when you talk about agriculture, some agriculture now is more industry than anything else. So, you know, I think there's a lot of opportunities for productive transformation in general. And this is why I am kind of personally moving away from saying industrial policy, because it's not just industry, it's productive transformation, and one has to try and experiment, you know, all the things from agriculture to services.
Okay, I think I'm not going to invite another question because they were quite detailed and questions with quite substantial answers. So we've covered a lot of territory actually in each of those questions. They were like many questions in one. So I hope you don't mind, but it's getting a little bit late. We don't want to go on for too long. Some people will have to go and get their dinner and be productive in that kind of way.